This is the moment where I try myself as a poet. So I decided to write a poem in the point of view of Charles Whitman, and it's a very short poem. It's not got a lot of merit, but it's important to me because it was the first time I thought I might have the makings. It's just called Tower. I love them in my own way, enough to pay hard cash for the rifle, to plan my strategy long into the night. I did not complain about the cold wind or the exhausting climb to the tower. Even the long wait and the rank-smelling pigeons never taxed my patience. When they emerged into the sun, when they emerged after a time into the bright winter sun at midday, I spared no effort to steady the rifle, to bring the delicate cross of the gun sights into line with their temples and breasts. And when they began to run, after the first had settled to rest in the soft snow, I never lost my cool, but took them, one by one, like a cat collecting kittens. I spent a little bit of time on the Orkney Islands a number of years ago and was astonished by the history of that place. They have ancient standing stones like the ones at Stonehenge. They have underground villages that have washed up and been exposed by changing sea levels. They had a ship from the Spanish Armada that tried to escape the English and ended up running aground on Orkney. So there's Spanish blood in Orkney. They had the Vikings, they had the Scots, and a whole different kind of settlement. And a great influence on Canada because most of the professionals and oarsmen, boatsmen that worked in the Hudson Bay Company came from Orkney. This poem is about another period in Orkney history, more recent. During the First World War, when the Germans were defeated, they brought the entire German fleet to Scapa Flow in Orkney, which was the Allied naval base during the First and Second War. And on a single day, the German officers and men pulled the plugs and sunk all those ships. So the Brits couldn't sell them to Canada the way they did the submarines. Anyway, this poem is from the point of view of a Scottish woman who remembers her parents who met in Orkney. And so I have to try to read this in a Scottish voice. I've got it on the wrong page here. Here we go. It's called How I Was Launched. Mother was a MacGregor from Inverness, a beanpole but ambitious, and tough as gorse. She would not so much turn her head as swivel her gaze, so one eye peered at you across the bridge of an aquiline nose. My father was an almost comic figure from Exmoor, whom she'd met while stationed in Orkney. She admired the way he danced the foxtrot, swallowed his vowels. His natural vulgarity survived military service unscathed. As a teenager, I would nickname them Jiggs and Maggie, after the cartoon characters. Maggie, the great pretender and social climber. Jiggs, the constant embarrassment with his top hat, cigarette, and bad manners. Always ducking out to eateries in Boston for a snack of corned beef and cabbage. My father finally persuaded her to sleep with him in the summer of 1919 in a small cottage overlooking Scapa Flow, where the German fleet was anchored, awaiting the results of the Versailles talks. She was sitting upright in bed, the sheet to her shoulders while he undressed, a cigarette in his hand. As he stepped out of his bell-bottoms and dropped his underwear, not a bit shy of his enthusiasm, she put her hand over her mouth to suppress a scream. Behind him, 54 ships, scuttled by defiant crews who jammed open sea cocks and took to the boats, were listing in odd angles in the glittering waves. My parents stood in the window naked, his arm around her hips, hers slung across his shoulders, and watched. He flicked a benediction of fine ash on the windowsill, looked down at his wilted submariner, and laughed. I'm going to read you the title poem of this book called What Does a House Want? It was written after a trip I took with the poet John Asfor, a Lebanese-Canadian friend who is blind. He and I went to the Middle East together, and we did readings in Palestinian and Israeli universities and in cultural centers and so on. Did a lot of human rights interviews with people. It was an odd experience traveling with John, who was blind. The only thing he really needed from me in the whole trip, he was so self-sufficient, this man, was when he got up in the morning, he said to me, "Gary, is this t-shirt blue or is it white?" For the rest of the time, he was the one with the real eyes. I was the blind one, and he was the one with the eyes, because he understood the Middle East. He'd lost his eyesight as a child when he picked up an Israeli grenade from a plane outside his village in Itanit, and it exploded. I was shocked at the time because it was right after the signing of the Oslo Accords, when there was a modicum of hope amongst the Palestinians and the more left-centered Israelis. But the Israeli Defense Force was building, was destroying Palestinian houses, and the settlers were building new settlements in the occupied territories. And so this poem came out. It's just called What Does a House Want? A house has no unreasonable expectations of travel or imperialist ambitions. A house wants to stay where it is. A house does not demonstrate against partition or harbor grievances. A house is a safe haven, anchorage, place of rest. Shut the door on excuses, greed, political expediency. A house remembers its original inhabitants, ventures comparisons. The woman tossing her hair by a doorstep, the man bent over his tools and patch of garden. What does a house want? Laughter, sounds of lovemaking to strengthen the walls. A house wants people, a permit to persevere. A house has no stones to spare. No house has ever been convicted of a felony unless privacy be considered a crime in the new dispensation. What does a house want? Firm joints, things on the level, water rising in pipes. Put out the eyes, forbid the drama of exits, entrances. Somewhere in the rubble, a mechanism leaks time. No place familiar for a fly to land on. I'm just going to read you one more poem. I think my red light is on up in the button there. This is a poem about the killings at Kent State University, which happened while I was a graduate student at the University of Toronto. And I tried for 6 years to write about it, but I was so full of anger and frustration that I couldn't write anything but a bad diatribe, of which there were plenty about American foreign policy. But 6 years later, I was at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, and I went out to the Wee Book Inn on White Avenue, and I found this tiny red paperback in the political science section. It was called The Killings at Kent State. And it was written by that great American journalist, I.F. Stone, whose reports bi-weekly were so good that even his enemies in politics had to read them to see what was really going on. There was a detail about one of the women, Sandra Lee Scheuer, and there were 4 details in that little book that I paid $1 for, that's tiny red paperback. She was a speech therapy student, she was very tidy, she was non-political, and she liked to roller skate. So I chucked 6 years of notes and wrote this poem in a few hours. You might have met her on a Saturday night, cutting precise circles clockwise at the Moonglow roller rink, or walking with quick step between the campus and a green 2-story house, where the room was always tidy, the bed made, the books in confraternity on the shelves. She did not throw stones, major in philosophy, or set fire to buildings, though acquaintances say she hated war, had heard of Cambodia. In truth, she wore a modicum of makeup, a brassiere, and could no doubt more easily have married a guardsman than cursed or put a flower in his rifle barrel. While the armories burned, she studied, bent low over notes, speech therapy books, pages open at sections on impairment, physiology. And while they milled and shouted on the commons, she helped a boy named Billy with his lisp, saying, "Hiss, Billy, like a snake. That's it. Sss, tongue well up and back behind your teeth. Now buzz, Billy, like a bee. Feel the air vibrating in my windpipe as I breathe." As she walked in sunlight through the parking lot at noon, feeling the world a passing lovely place, a young guardsman who had his sights on her was going down on one knee as if he might propose. His declaration, unmistakable, articulate, flowered within her, passed through her neck, severed her trachea, taking her breath away. Now who will burn the midnight oil for Billy, ensure the perilous freedom of his speech, and who will see her skating at the Moonglow roller rink, the 8 small wooden wheels making their countless revolutions on the floor?